Welcome to Cafe Tales, the widow who killed her husband with tea. Tonight's story begins, but before we dive in, thank you for being here with us. I'm your host, Ailey. And isn't it wonderful how these mysteries bring us together from all corners of the world? Leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, let's begin the mystery. Chapter 1: Scones, Silver, and a Sudden Silence. The February afternoon. Light filtered through the frost-etched windows of Briar Cottage's conservatory, casting delicate patterns across the polished flagstones. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen shawl and settled more comfortably into the wicker chair that Mrs. Eleanor Bryce had so thoughtfully positioned to catch the weak winter sun. Despite the season's chill, the glass-walled room retained a pleasant warmth thanks to the old-fashioned radiator that hummed quietly beneath the windows. "More tea, Miss Marple?" Colonel Arthur Bryce inquired, his weathered hand hovering over the gleaming silver teapot that dominated the wheeled trolley, positioned conveniently between them. "Most kind, Colonel," Miss Marple replied, watching with the gentle interest she brought to all domestic ceremonies as the retired shipping officer prepared to serve. Colonel Bryce was a man who took his small ritual seriously, she observed. His uniform remained impeccable even in retirement, his silver service polished to mirror brightness, and his manner retained the precise courtesy of a lifetime spent in command. The tea trolley itself was a testament to Mrs. Bryce's excellent housekeeping. The white cloth lay without a wrinkle. The china was arranged with mathematical precision, and the silver gleamed despite the Colonel's recent complaints about economizing. Miss Marple had heard whispers in the village about the Bryces tightening their belts, though nothing in their present circumstances suggested genuine hardship. "Sail unblend today," the Colonel announced with satisfaction, lifting the substantial teapot with practiced ease. None of that Indian rubbish for afternoon tea. His right hand gripped the ornate handle, while his left rested naturally on the warm radiator for balance. A habit, Miss Marple noted, born of long years handling heavy ship service. Mrs. Eleanor Bryce moved about the conservatory with quiet efficiency, adjusting a cushion here, straightening a magazine there. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s with graying hair arranged in a neat Marcel wave, and the composed bearing that came naturally to those who organized charity committees and headed garden societies. Her husband had chosen well, Miss Marple reflected, in selecting a wife who could manage both his household and his social obligations with equal competence. "Martin should be joining us presently," Mrs. Bryce remarked, glancing toward the house. "He's been wrestling with his correspondence all morning. The young man simply will not learn to manage his affairs properly." Colonel Bryce's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "The boy needs backbone, not coddling. When I was his age— Now, Arthur," his wife interrupted gently, "Martin is doing his best. These modern times are difficult for young people." Miss Marple suspected that Martin Bryce, the Colonel's nephew, who had taken lodgings with them the previous autumn, represented something of a domestic trial. She had observed him about the village, a pleasant enough young man with an easy smile and careless manner, but one who seemed perpetually short of funds and long on optimistic schemes that never quite materialized. The sound of footsteps on the flagstones announced the arrival of Hilda Sims, the daily maid whose practical competence kept Briar Cottage running smoothly. She carried a plate of fresh scones, still warm from the oven, and was followed by a sleek tabby cat who wound hopefully around her ankles. "Away with you, Tibbs," Hilda scolded affectionately. "You've had your share already." She set the plate on the trolley with careful precision, her weathered hands gentle despite their strength. Hilda had worked for the better families of St. Mary Me for 30 years, and Miss Marple knew her to be both discreet and observant, qualities that made her invaluable in a village where everyone's business was everyone else's concern. "The scones look delicious, Hilda," Miss Marple observed warmly. "You have such a light hand with pastry." Hilda flushed with pleasure. "Thank you kindly, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bryce likes them just so for afternoon tea." Colonel Bryce had completed his preparations and now held Miss Marple's cup aloft, steam rising fragrantly from the pale amber liquid. "Sugar, Miss Marple? I believe Eleonora has warmed it specially. Claims it pours more smoothly that way." "Just a touch, thank you." Miss Marple accepted the delicate china cup, noting the way the colonel's left hand maintained its casual contact with the radiator. Old habits, she supposed, developed during years of serving tea on ships. A steady brace was essential. The conversation turned to village matters, the upcoming church fete, the scandalous state of the vicarage roof, and Mrs. Bantry's latest horticultural triumph. Colonel Bryce contributed his views with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, while his wife offered gentle corrections and amplifications. It was the sort of comfortable domestic scene that Miss Marple had witnessed countless times, made pleasant by good tea, warm scones, and the civilized ritual of afternoon conversation. Martin Bryce appeared at the conservatory door, his fair hair slightly disheveled, and a sheaf of papers clutched in one hand. At 28, he possessed the kind of boyish charm that inspired maternal instincts in middle-aged ladies and suspicious frowns from their husbands. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he called cheerfully. "Aunt Eleonora, I finally sorted through those dreadful bills. Things aren't quite as black as they appeared." Colonel Bryce's jaw tightened. "About time you faced facts, my boy. A man must live within his means." "Oh, absolutely, Uncle Arthur. Sound fiscal policy and all that." Martin's tone remained determinedly cheerful, despite the underlying tension. "I say, is there tea? I'm positively gasping." Mrs. Bryce moved to fetch another cup, but her husband waved her back. "I'll manage, my dear. The pot's still perfectly hot." He reached again for the silver teapot, his movements as precise as always, right hand on the ornate handle, left hand seeking its familiar rest on the radiator. The next moment shattered, the peaceful afternoon like glass. Colonel Bryce stiffened, his body going rigid with shocking suddenness. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as the teapot crashed to the flagstones, sending a cascade of hot tea across the white cloth. His left hand remained pressed against the radiator as his knees buckled, and he collapsed heavily beside the overturned trolley. "Arthur!" Mrs. Bryce's cry cut through the sudden chaos as Hilda rushed forward, and Martin stood frozen in the doorway. Miss Marple was already kneeling beside the fallen man, her fingers seeking the pulse in his neck, while her sharp eyes took in every detail of the scene. The colonel's face had gone an alarming gray, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "Hilda, telephone the doctor." "Immediately," she commanded with quiet authority. "Mrs. Bryce, please sit down. Martin, fetch a cushion for your uncle's head." As the others hurried to obey, Miss Marple continued her examination. She had seen death often enough to recognize its approach, but something about the colonel's collapse troubled her orderly mind. The way he had stiffened, the peculiar rigidity of his posture, and the fact that his left hand had remained pressed against the radiator even as he fell. These details lodged themselves in her memory with the persistence of thorns. Dr. Haddock arrived within minutes, his professional calm a steadying presence. In the conservatory's aftermath, he knelt beside the colonel, his experienced hands moving swiftly as he checked pulse and breathing. "Heart," he muttered grimly, reaching for his medical bag. Sudden cardiac arrest, I'd say. Not entirely unexpected, at his age and with his history. But as he lifted the colonel's right hand to check for responsiveness, the doctor paused, frowning at something in the curve of the palm. Miss Marple leaned closer, her keen eyes following his gaze to a small reddened welt that marked the skin, like a burn. The doctor's frown deepened, but he said nothing more as he continued his examination. Within minutes, it was over. Colonel Arthur Bryce had breathed his last among the scattered fragments of his beloved silver service, leaving behind only questions that hung in the conservatory's suddenly chilled air, like the lingering scent of spilled Ceylon tea. Chapter 2. The teapot that was warm in the wrong place. The quiet that followed Dr. Haddock's departure hung over Briar Cottage like a shroud. In the conservatory, the overturned tea trolley remained exactly as it had fallen, its contents scattered across the flagstones in mute testimony to the afternoon's tragedy. Mrs. Bryce sat motionless in her chair, her hands folded in her lap with a composure that comes either from shock or from nerves held under rigid control. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his heavy boots echoing through the cottage with characteristic authority. Miss Marple had encountered the local inspector on several previous occasions, and while she found his methods somewhat pedestrian, she respected his thoroughness in routine matters. "Natural causes, I'm told," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notebook with the air of a man merely completing necessary formalities. "Dr. Haddock seems quite certain. Heart failure brought on by his age and previous condition. Still, we must observe the proper procedures." Miss Marple, who had remained in the conservatory at Mrs. Bryce's quiet request, watched the inspector's preliminary examination with the patient attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of knitting. There was something about the scene that continued to perplex her, though she could not yet identify the source of her unease. The tea was perfectly ordinary, Mrs. Bryce explained in response to the inspector's questions. Her voice remained steady, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers as she smoothed her skirt. Ceylon blend, as Arthur preferred. He took it without sugar, claimed it interfered with the flavor. "And you prepared it yourself, Mrs. Bryce?" "Naturally. Hilda brought the fresh scones, but I always attend to the tea service personally. Arthur was most particular about such things." A shadow of what might have been fondness crossed her features. 30 years in the merchant marine left him with very definite ideas about property. Inspector Slack nodded, making notes with the mechanical precision that characterized his approach to such matters. "Time of preparation?" "Just before 3 Bautories. We were expecting Miss Marple, and I wanted everything to be properly ready." Mrs. Bryce glanced toward the elderly detective with something approaching gratitude. "Arthur so enjoyed our afternoon conversations." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, though her attention had wandered to the tea service itself. The silver teapot lay on its side where it had fallen, its contents long since grown cold on the flagstones. Yet something about its position troubled her, a detail that nagged at her consciousness like a half-remembered melody. "I never use the electric warmer," Mrs. Bryce continued, following the inspector's gaze to the small appliance that sat beside the lamp on a nearby table. Arthur considered such modern conveniences unnecessary. The cozy keeps the tea quite warm enough for civilized consumption. Miss Marple rose from her chair with a careful deliberation that her years demanded, her keen eyes studying the arrangement of objects on and around the overturned trolley. The white cloth had absorbed much of the spilled tea, leaving dark stains that spread like ink across its pristine surface. Beneath the cloth, however, she noticed something curious. "Inspector," she ventured gently, "might I examine the trolley more closely? There seems to be something." Inspector Slack looked up from his notebook with the patient tolerance he reserved for elderly ladies who fancied themselves observant. By all means, Miss Marple, though I doubt there's anything to see beyond the obvious. With great care, Miss Marple lifted a corner of the stained cloth, peering beneath at the felt coaster that had cushioned the teapot's base. Her fingertips, still sensitive despite their age, detected a faint warmth in the circular impression, where the pot had rested. More intriguing still, the heat seemed to emanate not from residual tea temperature, but from something else entirely. Something that left a distinctive ring in the coaster's surface. "How very peculiar," she murmured. Half to herself, "What's that, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Bryce inquired, though her tone suggested only polite interest rather than genuine curiosity. "The coaster, my dear? It retains a most unusual warmth." Miss Marple straightened slowly, her gaze moving to the nearby lamp whose base plug caught her attention. "Inspector, might you test this plug? It seems rather warm for an appliance that appears to be switched off." Inspector Slack approached with skeptical efficiency, his large hand enveloping the plug in question. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Warm, right enough, though I suppose these old houses retain heat in odd ways." "Indeed they do," Mrs. Bryce agreed readily. "The conservatory is frightfully drafty, Inspector. Things cool very slowly here, despite the temperature outside." Arthur was always complaining about the peculiar way warmth lingers in some spots, while other areas remain quite chilly. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though her attention had shifted to other elements of the scene. The positioning of objects, the way the light fell through the windows, the subtle details that spoke of routine suddenly interrupted. All of these painted a picture that seemed somehow incomplete. Hilda Sims appeared in the doorway, her practical apron replaced by a black dress that spoke of hastily observed proprieties. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from grief or the bitter February wind remained unclear. "Begging your pardon," she said quietly. "But shall I clear away the tea things? It seems almost—" "Quite proper, Hilda," Mrs. Bryce assured her. "Arthur would not have wished us to stand on ceremony, though perhaps we might save the silver service for proper cleaning once the inspector is finished." "Leave everything exactly as it is for now," Inspector Slack commanded with unnecessary sharpness. "Official business takes precedence over housekeeping, however well-intentioned." Hilda bobbed and withdrew, though Miss Marple caught the flash of something, annoyance, suspicion, that crossed the maid's weathered features before she turned away. Martin Bryce had remained conspicuously absent during the official proceedings, though Miss Marple had heard his footsteps moving restlessly about the upper floors of the cottage. Young men, she reflected, often found death's formalities more disturbing than death itself, particularly when financial anxieties added their weight to natural grief. "The deceased had no known enemies?" Inspector Slack inquired, working through his standard checklist with methodical determination. "Arthur was universally respected," Mrs. Bryce replied firmly. "He held strong opinions, as military men often do, but he was fundamentally fair in his dealings. The village looked up to him." "Recent changes in circumstances, financial worries, family disputes?" A slight hesitation before Mrs. Bryce answered, so brief that Inspector Slack appeared not to notice. "Nothing beyond the ordinary concerns of retirement, Inspector. Arthur was adjusting to civilian life, as we all must after a career of service." Miss Marple filed away that moment's pause along with the other small inconsistencies that were beginning to accumulate in her mind, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The warm coaster, the heated plug, Mrs. Bryce's careful composure, Hilda's subdued manner. Each detail seemed innocuous in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that defied simple explanation. Dr. Haddock returned as the afternoon light began to fade, his professional duties requiring a final examination before the colonel's remains could be moved. He worked with quiet efficiency while the others waited in respectful silence. Heart. Failure, certainly, he confirmed to Inspector Slack in tones too low for casual eavesdropping. Though I must say, that mark on his palm continues to puzzle me, almost like a burn, though I can't imagine how he might have acquired it during afternoon tea. Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though she continued her examination of the conservatory's domestic details with apparent casual interest. A burn on the palm suggested contact with something unexpectedly hot, yet nothing in the tea service appeared capable of inflicting such an injury. The silver, while warm from the tea, would hardly have been hot enough to mark flesh. The radiator, perhaps? Yet Colonel Bryce's left hand had rested there naturally, as was his habit. The pieces of the puzzle remained stubbornly separate, refusing to arrange themselves into any coherent picture. Yet Miss Marple's long experience had taught her patience with such mysteries. Truth, like the finest embroidery, often revealed itself through the accumulation of tiny, seemingly insignificant stitches, rather than through dramatic revelations. As Inspector Slack concluded his examination and Dr. Haddock supervised the removal of Colonel Bryce's body, Miss Marple remained in the conservatory, her mind working over the afternoon's events with the persistence of a cat worrying a particularly intriguing ball of yarn. Somewhere in this domestically peaceful room lay the answer to questions she had not yet learned to ask properly. The shadows were lengthening across the frost-etched windows when Mrs. Bryce finally spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that follows shock. "Thank you for remaining, Miss Marple. Your presence has been most comforting during these difficult hours." "Not at all, my dear. One must do what one can when tragedy strikes." Miss Marple gathered her belongings with deliberate care, though her eyes continued their systematic study of the room's details. "I do hope you will not hesitate to call upon me if there is anything further I might do to assist." As she prepared to leave Briar Cottage, Miss Marple cast one final glance at the tea trolley with its burden of scattered silver and stained cloth. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would return, with fresh eyes and renewed attention to those small domestic details that so often held the keys to life's most perplexing mysteries. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a penny in the fuse box. The following morning brought one of those crisp February days when the frost transformed St. Mary Me into something resembling a Christmas card. Miss Marple, despite having slept poorly due to persistent thoughts about the previous afternoon's tragedy, found herself drawn once again to Briar Cottage. She told herself it was merely a neighborly call to offer comfort to the newly widowed Mrs. Bryce, though honesty compelled her to acknowledge that curiosity played an equal part in her motivations. Inspector Slack's motorcar stood in the cottage drive, its official presence lending gravity to what might otherwise have appeared a routine condolence visit. Miss Marple approached the front door with the measured pace of elderly respectability, her keen eyes noting the pristine condition of the brass fittings and the military precision with which the gravel had been raked. Hilda Sims admitted her with subdued courtesy, the maid's manner suggesting a household struggling to maintain normality in the face of sudden disruption. The woman's practical nature had reasserted itself overnight, Miss Marple observed, though shadows beneath her eyes spoke of genuine distress rather than mere inconvenience. "Mrs. Bryce is in the morning room with the inspector," Hilda explained, taking Miss Marple's coat with careful attention. "She asked particularly that you be shown in directly should you call." The morning room faced east, catching what pale sunlight February could provide through windows framed by cheerful chintz curtains. Mrs. Bryce sat at a small escritoire, various papers spread before her with the methodical organization that characterized all her domestic arrangements. Inspector Slack occupied a nearby chair, his notebook open, and his expression bearing the satisfied look of a man completing necessary formalities. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call." Mrs. Bryce rose with the automatic grace of long-practiced hospitality. "Inspector Slack has been helping me understand the various procedures that must be observed. I confess I find such matters rather bewildering." "Perfectly natural, ma'am," the inspector assured her with gruff kindness. "These administrative requirements can seem overwhelming at such times. Better to handle them properly from the start, rather than face complications later." Miss Marple accepted the offered chair with grateful murmurs, though her attention wandered to the inspector's activities. His methodical nature, which she had previously found somewhat plodding, appeared well suited to guiding a widow through bureaucratic necessities. Death, she reflected, generated an astonishing quantity of official paperwork, even when it arrived through entirely natural causes. "I trust the arrangements are proceeding smoothly?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle concern. "As well as can be expected," Mrs. Bryce replied, though something in her tone suggested underlying strain. "There have been a few minor complications. Nothing serious, of course. But these old houses do present their challenges." Inspector Slack glanced up from his notes with mild interest. "The electrical difficulties Mrs. Bryce mentioned? Quite common in properties of this age, I understand." "Oh yes, the fuses." Mrs. Bryce sighed with the weariness of someone facing yet another domestic crisis. "They've been troublesome all winter. Yesterday morning was particularly vexing. They kept popping at the most inconvenient moments." Hilda was quite beside herself trying to manage the household routine. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she maintained her expression of sympathetic concern. Electrical problems in conjunction with yesterday's peculiar warmth around the lamp and teapot struck her as potentially significant, though the connection remained frustratingly unclear. "Might one examine these troublesome fuses?" she suggested, with the diffident air of someone offering purely amateur assistance. "I've encountered similar difficulties at my own cottage. Sometimes the solution proved surprisingly simple." Inspector Slack looked mildly amused by this domestic consultation between ladies, but Mrs. Bryce appeared genuinely grateful for any distraction from administrative complexities. "How very kind, Miss Marple. The fuse box is in the scullery, rather an awkward location, but these older installations were never designed with convenience in mind." The three made their way to the cottage's working quarters, where the scullery's practical functionality contrasted sharply with the comfortable elegance of the main rooms. The fuse box occupied a position near the back door, its metal housing showing the accumulated dust and minor corrosion of long service. Inspector Slack approached the device with professional caution, though his expertise clearly lay in areas far removed from domestic electricity. "Rewirable type," he noted, consulting. "The ceramic fuse holders with their maze of wire connections. Haven't seen many of these lately." Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the fuse box interior and the faces of her companions. Her sharp eyes, aided by the morning light streaming through the scullery window, examined each fuse holder with careful attention to detail. "How curious," she murmured, peering more closely at one particular position. "Inspector, might you look at this central fuse? There appears to be something rather unusual about it." Inspector Slack bent forward, his bulk blocking much of the available light as he studied the indicated component. After a moment's examination, his eyebrows rose with surprise. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, then caught himself with an apologetic glance toward the ladies. Begging your pardon, but there's a penny coin wedged in place of the proper fuse wire. Mrs. Bryce moved closer, her expression showing polite bewilderment. A penny? However did that happen? A very thrifty village trick, Inspector, Miss Marple observed with gentle amusement, though her tone carried undertones that suggested deeper consideration. When proper fuse wire proves expensive or unavailable, a coin provides a temporary solution, though I believe electricians consider such expedients rather dangerous. Dangerous indeed. Inspector Slack confirmed, extracting the offending penny with careful fingers. A proper fuse cuts power when there's a fault, prevents fires, electrocution, all manner of unpleasantness. A coin just continues conducting current regardless of circumstances. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing away this information alongside the previous day's peculiarities. The pattern remained incomplete, but additional pieces were beginning to emerge. A bypassed safety device, mysterious warmth in unexpected places, and now evidence of domestic electrical irregularities that coincided with Colonel Bryce's fatal collapse. Mrs. Bryce mentioned these fuses had been troublesome, she inquired with casual interest. Oh yes, popping constantly yesterday morning, Mrs. Bryce confirmed readily. Hilda was quite distressed. She couldn't complete her routine cleaning without the power failing every few minutes. I'm afraid I resorted to this temporary measure, just to maintain normal household operations. When did you install the penny? Mrs. Bryce paused, clearly searching her memory for specific details. Just after breakfast, I believe. The fuses had been particularly troublesome overnight, and I simply couldn't face another day of constant interruptions. Arthur was already irritated by the inconvenience. He disliked any disruption to his morning routine. Inspector Slack examined the penny with professional interest, noting its recent handling and the slight discoloration where it had made contact with the electrical terminals. Simple enough fix, he commented. Though you'll want a proper electrician to install correct fusing before using the circuit again. Miss Marple continued her study of the fuse box arrangement, her mind working through the implications of what they had discovered. A safety device deliberately bypassed on the morning of Colonel Bryce's death, combined with the previous day's evidence of unexpected electrical activity, suggested possibilities that extended beyond mere domestic inconvenience. The circuit controlled by this particular fuse? She asked with the air of someone seeking purely technical enlightenment. Mrs. Bryce consulted a handwritten chart affixed to the box's interior, the conservatory and morning room primarily. Arthur insisted on proper labeling when we moved here. Military precision in all things, you understand. The conservatory. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that accompanied the fitting together of previously separate elements. The scene of Colonel Bryce's death had been protected by a safety device that had been deliberately rendered inoperative on the very morning of the tragedy. Most organized of the Colonel, Inspector Slack observed approvingly. Proper planning prevents problems, as they say. Miss Marple murmured agreement, though her thoughts had moved far beyond administrative efficiency. The accumulating evidence suggested a level of preparation and forethought that seemed inconsistent with sudden cardiac failure during afternoon tea. Yet the alternative implications remained too shocking to voice, without substantially more proof than a bypassed fuse and some unexplained warmth. As they returned to the morning room, Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Bryce with renewed attention. The widow's composed manner and practical responses to official requirements spoke of either remarkable self-control or something more disturbing. Time and careful observation, would be needed to distinguish between natural grief disciplined by good breeding and the artificial calm of calculated deception. "You've been most helpful, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bryce said warmly as they settled again among the administrative papers. "I confess these practical matters quite overwhelm me. Arthur handled all such things during our marriage." "Not at all. My dear, we must all learn to cope with life's necessities, however unwelcome they may prove." Miss Marple spoke with genuine sympathy, yet her mind continued working through the morning's discoveries. A penny in the fuse box might represent nothing more than domestic expediency, but combined with yesterday's anomalies, it suggested questions that demanded considerably more investigation than Inspector Slack's routine inquiries would provide. Chapter 4. The Sugar Bowl on the Radiator. The afternoon had settled into that peculiar quietness that follows in the wake of official business, when Miss Marple found herself once again in conversation with Hilda Sims. The maid had emerged from the Colonel's study where she had been dusting with her customary thoroughness, her movements carrying the mechanical precision of someone seeking solace in familiar routine. "Such a shock it's been," Hilda confided as she paused to adjust a photograph on the hall table. "30 years I've been in service, Miss Marple, and I've never seen the like. One moment he was his usual self, particular about his tea and fussing over the silver, and the next—" She shook her head sorrowfully. Miss Marple nodded with understanding sympathy, recognizing in the woman's manner that peculiar need to talk that often follows sudden death. Servants, she had long observed, frequently possessed the clearest view of household dynamics, unencumbered as they were by the emotional complications that clouded family perspectives. "The Colonel was very set in his ways, I imagine," Miss Marple encouraged gently. "Oh, indeed he was. Everything just so. And heaven help anyone who disturbed his arrangements." Hilda's expression softened with what might have been affection. "But fair in his way, if you understood his expectations. Never a harsh word if the work was done properly." They moved toward the conservatory, where afternoon sunlight revealed the lingering evidence of yesterday's tragedy. The tea trolley had been restored to its proper position, though the stained cloth remained as a reminder of the violence that had interrupted their peaceful gathering. "I keep thinking about those last few minutes," Hilda continued, her voice dropping to the confidential tone that domestic staff employed when sharing observations with trusted outsiders. "Miss Bryce had me set the sugar bowl to warm on the radiator just before tea time. It pours better when warmed," she said, though I'd never heard such a thing in all my years. Miss Marple's attention sharpened with the subtle intensity of a cat detecting movement in tall grass. The sugar bowl on the radiator. How very interesting. Was this a usual practice? "Never before, Miss Marple. Always kept the sugar in the pantry, until needed, but Mrs. Bryce was most particular about it yesterday, said the Colonel preferred it that way, though I'd served him tea for 3 years and never heard him mention such a preference." The two women approached the radiator in question, its cast-iron surface still radiating gentle warmth into the conservatory's chilled air. Miss Marple examined the top with careful attention, noting a faint ring of condensation that marked where something damp and bowl-shaped had recently rested. "You placed the sugar bowl here at Mrs. Bryce's instruction?" "That I did, though it seemed a peculiar notion to me. Heavy crystal it was, with a good deal of weight to it. Seemed an odd place to balance such a thing, what with a trolley being wheeled about and all." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind working through the implications of this domestic detail. She recalled with perfect clarity the Colonel's habitual posture when serving tea, right hand gripping the substantial silver teapot, left hand seeking support on the radiator's convenient surface, a routine so established that even Martin had unconsciously mimicked it when reaching for serving implements. "The Colonel's usual manner when pouring?" she inquired with casual interest. "Oh, always the same. Bless him. Proper military bearing even at tea time. Right hand for the pot, heavy old thing it was, and his left braced against the radiator for steadiness. Quite natural in a gentleman of his years, I always thought, Miss." Marple watched as Hilda demonstrated the posture, her work-worn hands mimicking the Colonel's final movements with unconscious accuracy. The gesture emphasized how inevitable the contact with the radiator had been, how any elderly gentleman handling the weighty silver service would have sought exactly that support. "Quite natural indeed," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone carried undertones of deeper consideration. "And the sugar bowl remained on the radiator throughout tea time, until just after the tragedy, when I cleared it, away with the other things. Seemed proper to restore some order, though Mrs. Bryce was too distressed to notice such details." The evidence was accumulating with disturbing consistency, Miss Marple reflected. Each seemingly innocent domestic arrangement appeared calculated to ensure that Colonel Bryce would follow his established routine exactly. The warm sugar bowl positioned precisely where his supporting hand would rest, the familiar weight of the teapot requiring its customary brace, the entire ceremony proceeding according to patterns established over years of afternoon service. "You mentioned the Colonel's particular habits regarding the silver," Miss Marple prompted gently, "obsessed with its proper care. He had it polished twice weekly, proper handling, no shortcuts or modern cleaning methods. Said it reminded him of his naval days, when standards meant something." Hilda's expression grew troubled. Strange to think those same habits might have... She let the sentence trail away, but Miss Marple understood the unspoken implication. The Colonel's meticulous attention to his possessions, his insistence on personal service of the tea, his invariable posture when handling the heavy pot, all had contributed to ensuring he would be in exactly the right position when death claimed him. "Martin often helped with the tea service?" Miss Marple asked, remembering the young man's easy familiarity with the routine. "When he was about, though he's been rather scarce lately. Money troubles, I suspect, though it's not my place to speculate." Hilda lowered her voice further. "The Colonel was becoming quite stern about it. Mentioned something about teaching the boy responsibility through practical experience." Miss Marple filed away this intelligence alongside her growing collection of significant details. Family tensions over financial matters provided classic motives for domestic tragedy, though Martin's cheerful incompetence seemed inconsistent with the methodical planning that yesterday's events increasingly suggested. Sound from the main house interrupted their conversation, the measured tread of Inspector Slack's boots as he completed his final examination of the premises. His investigation had been thorough within its conventional limits, Miss Marple acknowledged, though she suspected his focus on natural causes had prevented consideration of more sinister possibilities. "Miss Marple," the inspector's voice carried the satisfaction of completed duty. "Mrs. Bryce asked me to find you. There are a few final questions about yesterday's timeline that require clarification." As they made their way back to the morning room, Miss Marple's mind continued processing the afternoon's revelations. The sugar bowl's placement, like the bypassed fuse and the mysterious warmth, represented another piece in an increasingly complex puzzle. Each detail appeared innocent, in isolation, yet together they suggested a level of preparation and foresight that seemed inconsistent with sudden cardiac failure. Mrs. Bryce awaited them with her customary composure, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain in the slight tension around her eyes and the careful way she held her hands folded in her lap. The widow's remarkable self-control was admirable, yet it also raised questions about the true depth of her grief. Inspector Slack requires confirmation of the precise sequence of events yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Bryce explained with weary patience. I confess the details have become somewhat blurred in my memory. Shock, I suppose, makes one's recollections unreliable. Miss Marple settled into her chair with a deliberate care of age, though her mind remained sharply focused on every nuance of expression and tone that might reveal hidden truths beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. The sugar bowl's strategic placement had opened new avenues of inquiry, and she intended to pursue them with the persistent patience that had served her well in previous encounters with domestic mystery. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Inspector Slack completed his final notes, apparently satisfied that natural causes provided adequate explanation for Colonel Bryce's demise. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly convinced that the truth lay buried beneath layers of careful preparation and calculated misdirection that would require considerably more investigation to uncover. Chapter 5. The Tea Cozy That Smelled of Solder. Lady Bantry arrived at Briar Cottage the following morning with characteristic decisiveness, her arms laden with offerings from Gossington Hall's well-stocked pantry. Dolly Bantry had never been one to let social awkwardness prevent the performance of neighborly duty, and death in the village called for immediate and practical response. "Eleonora, my dear," she announced upon entering the morning room, "I've brought provisions. One simply cannot be expected to think about cooking at such a time." She deposited her parcels with efficient kindness before settling herself with the air of someone prepared for extended consolation. Miss Marple, who had arrived earlier to assist with correspondence, observed this domestic ritual with warm appreciation. Lady Bantry's forthright manner provided a welcome contrast to the subdued atmosphere that had settled over the cottage like morning mist. "Most thoughtful, Dolly," Mrs. Bryce responded with genuine gratitude. "I confess I've had little appetite since Tuesday afternoon. Perfectly natural, though you must maintain your strength. Arthur would never forgive us for allowing you to neglect your health." Lady Bantry's practical sympathy carried the authority of long friendship. "Now then, what arrangements require attention? I'm entirely at your disposal." As the two women discussed funeral preparations and social obligations, Miss Marple found her attention drawn once again to the conservatory and its lingering evidence of Tuesday's tragedy. The restored tea service gleamed with Hilda's careful polishing, yet something about the arrangement continued to perplex her orderly mind. "Might I examine the tea service more closely?" she ventured during a pause in the conversation. "There are certain details about Tuesday afternoon that remain unclear in my memory." Mrs. Bryce gestured toward the conservatory with weary acceptance. "By all means, Miss Marple, though I cannot imagine what significance such domestic details might hold." The three women moved to the glass-walled room, where February sunlight revealed every nuance of the carefully maintained tea trolley. Miss Marple approached the silver service with the reverent attention she might have accorded a particularly intricate piece of needlework, her keen eyes noting the perfection of Hilda's restoration work. Lady Bantry, however, paused beside the trolley, with a puzzled expression. "How peculiar," she murmured, lifting the quilted tea cozy that protected the restored teapot. "There's the most unusual odor about this thing." Miss Marple moved closer as Dolly held the cozy toward the light, its cheerful pattern of roses and forget-me-nots appearing innocuous despite whatever had attracted her friend's attention. "Metallic, dear, and something sharp," Lady Bantry continued, wrinkling her nose with distaste. "Rather like, well, I hesitate to say, but it reminds me of Colonel Bantry's workshop when he was soldering those wretched model soldiers. The I observation struck Miss Marple with the force of revelation. Solder possessed a distinctive odor, acrid and metallic, that lingered in fabric far longer than more pleasant scents. She accepted the cozy from Lady Bantry's hands and examined it with renewed intensity. "Most interesting," she murmured, turning the quilted covering inside out to reveal its practical cotton lining. "Dolly, your nose for unusual odors has always been remarkably acute." Indeed, embedded within the cozy's interior fabric lay evidence that confirmed Lady Bantry's observation. A subtle brown scorch mark in an oval pattern, as though something heated had been pressed against the material and held there until the cotton began to char. "How very strange," Mrs. Bryce commented, though her tone suggested polite bewilderment rather than genuine surprise. "I cannot imagine how such a mark might have appeared. Hilda is most careful with the household linens." Miss Marple continued her examination of the tea service itself, her experienced fingers tracing the elegant curves of the silver teapot with delicate precision. The craftsmanship was exceptional, clearly the work of skilled silversmiths who had understood both beauty and functionality. Yet something about the handle drew her particular attention. "The silver work is quite remarkable," she observed, studying the hollow construction that characterized quality pieces. "Such intricate joinery where the handle meets the body." Lady Bantry leaned closer, her interest piqued by Miss Marple's careful scrutiny. Arthur was frightfully proud of that service. Naval tradition, he claimed. Property demanded proper equipment. Miss Marple's fingertip detected an almost imperceptible irregularity near the ferrule where handle joined pot, a tiny bubble of metal that caught the light differently from the surrounding silver. The mark was so small as to be nearly invisible, yet its presence suggested recent work by someone familiar with metalworking techniques. "Mrs. Bryce, might I inquire whether you've had any silversmith work done recently?" Miss Marple asked with casual interest. "This small mark suggests professional attention." Mrs. Bryce moved closer to examine the indicated spot, her expression reflecting careful consideration. "A silversmith? Well, there was someone here last month, a traveling craftsman who offered to restore some of our older pieces. Arthur was quite pleased with his work." "How fortunate to find skilled workmanship in these modern times," Miss Marple commented. "So many of the old techniques are being lost." "Indeed, though I must say the man charged rather dear for his services." Mrs. Bryce's tone carried the slight irritation of someone who remembered financial inconvenience. Arthur insisted it was worth the expense for proper restoration. Lady Bantry had returned to her examination of the tea, cozy, her practical mind, clearly troubled by the evidence of burning within its folds. "Eleonora, dear, are you quite certain about this silversmith? Because I must tell you, this scorch pattern suggests someone has been using this cozy to handle something considerably hotter than a teapot." Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that accompanied the fitting together of previously separate clues. A tea cozy that smelled of solder and bore evidence of contact with heated metal, combined with recent modification to the silver service, suggested possibilities that extended far beyond routine restoration work. "Hilda might remember more details about the silversmith's visit," she suggested diplomatically. "Servants often observe such matters more closely than we realize." Mrs. Bryce's composure flickered almost imperceptibly before reasserting itself. "Hilda mentioned no such visitor to me. Perhaps you're mistaken about the recent work, Miss Marple. The piece may simply show its age." Yet Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the telltale signs of fresh solder work, the slightly different coloration where new metal had been applied, the careful disguise achieved through strategic polishing. Someone had recently modified the teapot's handle with considerable skill. then attempted to conceal their handiwork through meticulous finishing. Lady Bantry continued her investigation of the cozy's interior, her thoroughness revealing additional evidence of exposure to unusual heat. "There are several small marks here, Jane, almost as though someone had pressed heated implements against the fabric repeatedly." The accumulating evidence painted an increasingly disturbing picture. A tea cozy used to handle heated metalworking tools, recent modification to the silver service, and the lingering scent of solder all suggested preparation far more elaborate than simple household maintenance. "Perhaps we should consult Hilda about these observations," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Her knowledge of household matters might clarify these puzzling details." Mrs. Bryce's agreement came with obvious reluctance, though social convention required her cooperation with what appeared to merely curious inquiry from well-meaning neighbors. Yet Miss Marple detected beneath the widow's composed exterior an attention that suggested considerably more knowledge about recent events than she had chosen to reveal. As they summoned Hilda to join their investigation, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the growing complexity of what had initially appeared a straightforward case of natural death. The cozy's evidence, combined with the previous discoveries, suggested a level of technical preparation that seemed far removed from Colonel Bryce's simple afternoon collapse. The truth she suspected lay hidden beneath layers of careful deception that would require patient unraveling to expose the full extent of what had actually occurred in Briar Cottage's peaceful conservatory. Chapter 6. Damp Tiles and the House Slippers. Hilda's arrival in the conservatory brought with it an atmosphere of barely suppressed anxiety that Miss Marple noted with the sharp attention she accorded all shifts in domestic equilibrium. The maid's usual confident bearing had given way to something approaching nervousness. Her work-roughened hands twisted the corner of her apron in a gesture that spoke of inner turmoil. "You wish to see me about the tea service?" Hilda inquired, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that servants employed when uncertain of their ground. Lady Bantry, never one for diplomatic circumvention, held up the scorched tea cozy with characteristic directness. "We're trying to understand how this came to smell of solder and acquire these peculiar burn marks. Miss Marple suggested you might recall something helpful." Hilda examined the offered cozy with growing bewilderment, her honest features reflecting genuine surprise at the evidence of damage. "I've never seen such marks before, my lady. I clean that cozy regular-like, and I'd have noticed such a burn straight away." Miss Marple observed this exchange with careful attention to nuance and gesture, her experience having taught her that truth and deception often revealed themselves through the smallest details of behavior. Hilda's confusion appeared authentic, suggesting that whatever had occurred with the tea cozy had happened without her knowledge or participation. "The conservatory tiles," Miss Marple remarked with casual precision, "were they particularly wet on Tuesday afternoon? I recall noticing considerable dampness near the radiator." "Oh yes, miss," Hilda replied with evident relief at addressing a more straightforward inquiry. "Mrs. Bryce had me mop them special just before tea time. Make them gleam," she said, though it seemed an odd time for such work with guests expected. Mrs. Bryce shifted uncomfortably in her chair, though her voice remained steady as she explained. The conservatory had become rather dusty over the winter. I felt it important to present a proper appearance for our guests." Miss Marple nodded with apparent understanding, though her mind was working through the implications of freshly mopped floors in conjunction with the afternoon's tragic events. Wet tiles would conduct electricity far more effectively than dry ones, creating precisely the conditions that would maximize any electrical hazard. "The Colonel's footwear that afternoon?" she inquired with the air of someone seeking purely incidental information. His house slippers, miss, Hilda confirmed readily. Brown leather ones he favored for indoor wear. Said proper shoes were for zage, outdoors, and slippers for comfort at home. Very particular about such distinctions was the colonel. Lady Bantry's practical mind immediately grasped the significance of this detail. Leather soles would provide little protection against electrical conduction, particularly on damp tiles, unlike rubber, which offers considerable insulation. Mrs. Bryce's composure flickered momentarily before reasserting itself. I wore my galoshes that afternoon due to the freshly mopped floors. Rubber soles seemed more practical given the circumstances. The distinction struck Miss Marple as potentially crucial. While Colonel Bryce had stood on wet tiles in leather-soled slippers, his wife had protected herself with rubber footwear that would provide effective insulation against electrical hazards. Such forethought suggested either remarkable prescience or careful planning. Dr. Haydock appeared at the conservatory entrance, his medical bag indicating a professional visit rather than social call. His grave expression suggested matters of considerable importance as he approached the assembled group. Ladies, he greeted with subdued courtesy. Mrs. Bryce, I've completed my examination of your husband's effects and must discuss certain findings with you. Mrs. Bryce rose with dignity, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of tension in the careful way she arranged her skirts and positioned her hands. Of course, Doctor. How may I assist you? Dr. Haydock glanced meaningfully toward Miss Marple, and Lady Bantry, clearly uncertain whether his communication required privacy. Mrs. Bryce, however, gestured for him to continue. The burn mark on your husband's palm, Doctor began carefully, has prompted me to reconsider the circumstances of his death. While cardiac arrest remains the immediate cause, I'm increasingly convinced that electrical shock may have triggered the heart failure. The pronouncement fell into the conservatory's atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication through the assembled group. Hilda gasped audibly, while Lady Bantry's eyebrows rose with sharp interest. Electrical shock? Mrs. Bryce repeated with apparent bewilderment. But, Doctor, how could such a thing occur during afternoon tea? That remains unclear, Doctor admitted, though his professional concern was evident. However, the burn pattern on his palm is consistent with electrical contact, and the circumstances of his collapse suggest current passing across his chest. Such a shock could easily induce fatal cardiac arrhythmia in a man of his age. Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Bryce's reaction with renewed intensity. The widow's surprise appeared genuine, yet there remained something calculated in her responses that suggested careful preparation for exactly such revelations. The wet floors would certainly increase conductivity, Doctor continued, his medical training leading him to examine all relevant factors. And leather soles provide minimal insulation against electrical hazards. The combination could prove quite dangerous under the right circumstances. Lady Bantry's practical mind immediately engaged with the technical aspects of the problem. But, Doctor, what could possibly have been electrified during afternoon tea? The silver service was perfectly ordinary, and there are no exposed electrical connections in the conservatory. That puzzles me as well, Dr. Haydock confessed. Yet the evidence suggests electrical involvement in Colonel Bryce's death. Perhaps Inspector Slack should examine the premises more thoroughly from this perspective. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind working through the accumulating evidence with systematic precision. The freshly mopped tiles, the leather slippers, the rubber-soled galoshes, and now medical confirmation of electrical involvement, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated tragedy, disguised as natural death. Hilda, she said gently, you mentioned that Mrs. Bryce specifically requested the floor mopping just before tea. Was this unusual timing? Oh, yes, miss. Generally, we clean the conservatory in the morning, not just before entertaining. Seems strange to me, but Mrs. Bryce was quite insistent about having everything perfect. The maid's honest confusion provided additional confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. Each domestic detail had been carefully arranged to create optimal conditions for the tragedy that followed, yet disguised as ordinary household preparations. As Dr. Haydock departed with promises to consult Inspector Slack about his findings, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the methodical nature of what was beginning to appear as premeditated murder. The killer had possessed both technical knowledge and intimate familiarity with Colonel Bryce's habits, using both to create an apparently impossible crime that had nearly succeeded in passing as natural death. Chapter 7. The Letter to the Solicitor and the Cat at the Door. The revelation of electrical involvement in Colonel Bryce's death had cast a new shadow over what had seemed a tragic but straightforward case of natural causes. Miss Marple found herself walking slowly through St. Mary Mead's familiar lanes that afternoon, her mind working through the implications of Dr. Haddock's findings with the methodical patience that characterized her approach to life's more perplexing puzzles. Lady Bantry intercepted her near the village green, emerging from the post office with the purposeful stride of someone bearing significant intelligence. Dolly's expression carried that particular combination of excitement and concern that indicated news of considerable importance to their ongoing investigation. "Jane, my dear, the most extraordinary thing," Lady Bantry announced without preamble. "I've just encountered young Pettibone from Messrs. Peabody and Associates, you know, the solicitors in market basing. He mentioned something quite remarkable about a recent communication from Colonel Bryce." Miss Marple paused beside the village Green's weathered memorial, her attention fully engaged despite her casual demeanor. Legal matters, in her experience, often provided crucial insights into domestic mysteries, particularly when they involve questions of inheritance and financial provision. "The Colonel had consulted his solicitor recently?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle interest. "Indeed he had. Young Pettibone was most discreet, of course, but he did mention that the Colonel had written regarding alterations to his will, quite substantial changes, apparently, concerning the disposition of his estate." Lady Bantry's voice dropped to the confidential tone appropriate for such sensitive matters. This intelligence struck Miss Marple as potentially significant, given the financial tensions she had observed within the Bryce household. Martin's debts, the Colonel's complaints about economizing, and now evidence of planned changes to testamentary arrangements suggested motives that extended beyond simple domestic harmony. Did young Pettibone indicate the nature of these proposed alterations? He was properly circumspect, naturally, but he did suggest that the changes would have favored the male line. Something about the Colonel's views on ladies managing financial affairs. You know how these military gentlemen can be about such matters. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, understanding the implications immediately. If Colonel Bryce had intended to alter his will in Martin's favor, his death would have prevented such changes from taking effect, leaving his estate to pass under existing arrangements. The timing of his demise thus became crucially significant for all potential beneficiaries. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Hilda Sims, who approached with the slightly breathless manner of someone seeking urgent consultation. The maid's usual composure had given way to evident distress, her practical features reflecting genuine concern about matters that clearly troubled her conscience. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but there's something been bothering me about Tuesday afternoon, something I didn't think important at the time, but now with all this talk of electrical matters." Miss Marple encouraged her to continue with the gentle patience that invited confidences from even the most reticent witnesses. Servants' observations, she knew, often provided the most accurate accounts of domestic events, uncolored as they were by emotional involvement or self-interest. "It's about Tibbs, miss, the cottage cat. He's always been fond of jumping onto the tea trolley, hoping for cream or a bit of attention from the colonel. But lately he's refused to go near it. Started quite suddenly about a fortnight ago." Lady Bantry's practical mind immediately grasped the potential significance of this feline behavior. Animals often sense dangers that humans overlook. What exactly happened to change the cat's habits? He got a terrible start one afternoon when his tail brushed against the lamp cord near the trolley, jumped away like he'd been burned, he did, and refused to approach the area afterward. "I thought it was just fancy at first. But now—" Hilda's voice trailed away as she contemplated the possible implications. Miss Marple filed away this observation. With the growing collection of evidence that suggested electrical irregularities in the conservatory, predating Colonel Bryce's death, a cat's instinctive avoidance of the tea trolley area indicated potential hazards that human senses might not detect, particularly if those hazards were intermittent or carefully concealed. Mrs. Bryce's response to the cat's changed behavior? Miss Marple inquired diplomatically. She said Tibbs was getting fanciful with age, suggested he was imagining dangers where none existed. But I've known that cat for 3 years, and he's not given to nervous starts without cause. The three women exchanged meaningful glances as the implications of Hilda's testimony became clear. If electrical hazards had existed around the tea trolley for several weeks before Colonel Bryce's death, it suggested careful preparation rather than sudden malfunction or accidental circumstance. "The lamp cord that startled Tibbs," Miss Marple continued carefully. "Did you notice anything unusual about its condition?" Hilda's expression grew troubled as she searched her memory for specific details. "Nothing obvious, miss. Though I did notice Miss Bryce had been particular about keeping it tidy. Usually, she leaves such matters to me, but she'd taken to arranging the cord herself, very neat and precise-like." Lady Bantry's eyebrows rose with sharp interest. "Eleonora managing electrical cords herself? That seems rather out of character. She's never shown interest in such practical matters." Miss Marple found herself contemplating the accumulating evidence, with growing certainty about the true nature of Colonel Bryce's death. The proposed will changes, the cat's instinctive avoidance, and Mrs. Bryce's uncharacteristic attention to electrical details, all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated tragedy designed to appear entirely natural. "Hilda," she said gently, "you mentioned Mrs. Bryce's unusual precision about the lamp cord arrangement. Were there other changes in her domestic habits during recent weeks?" The maid considered this question with the thoroughness that characterized her approach to household matters. She, taken to doing certain tasks herself that she usually left to me, small things mostly, polishing the silver more often than necessary, checking the electrical connections, even examining the fuse box in the scullery. All matters requiring technical knowledge or access to household systems, Lady Bantry observed with growing understanding. Preparation, one might say, for someone planning electrical modifications. Miss Marple nodded grimly, recognizing, in these domestic changes, the systematic preparation that preceded calculated murder. Mrs. Bryce had clearly spent considerable time familiarizing herself with the cottage's electrical systems, learning to manipulate them for purposes far removed from ordinary household management. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the methodical nature of what was emerging as a particularly cunning crime. The killer had combined technical knowledge with intimate understanding of the victim's habits, creating a death that appeared entirely natural, while actually representing careful premeditation disguised as domestic accident. The challenge now lay in proving what her accumulated observations increasingly suggested. For circumstantial evidence, however compelling, required substantial corroboration before it could support accusations of murder against a respectable widow whose grief appeared entirely genuine to casual observation. Chapter 8: A Teaspoon with a Scorched Edge. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Briar Cottage with renewed purpose, Dr. Haydock's medical concerns having prompted a more thorough examination of the conservatory and its contents. Miss Marple, arriving to offer assistance with correspondence, found herself once again positioned to observe the official investigation with the quiet attention that had served her well in previous encounters with domestic mystery. Mrs. Bryce received the inspector's return with composed resignation, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain beneath the widow's carefully maintained facade. The prospect of renewed scrutiny clearly troubled her, despite her apparent cooperation with all official requirements. Dr. Haydock's findings necessitate a more detailed examination, Inspector Slack explained, with the apologetic firmness that characterized his approach to unpleasant duties. Electrical involvement in your husband's death requires investigation of all relevant systems and appliances. The inspector's methodical nature, which Miss Marple had previously found somewhat limited, proved well suited to systematic technical examination. He approached the conservatory's electrical fixtures with professional caution, testing connections and examining equipment with the thoroughness that safety considerations demanded. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the inspector's discoveries and Mrs. Bryce's reactions to them. The tea service, restored to its customary perfection by Hilda's careful attention, gleamed innocently on the trolley that had been the scene of Tuesday's tragedy. "The lamp cord appears in good condition, Inspector," Slack announced, examining the flex that connected the table lamp to its wall socket. Yet, as he traced the cord's length, his expression grew puzzled. "There's a small nick in the rubber covering here, though it doesn't appear to compromise the internal wiring." Miss Marple moved closer to examine the indicated damage, noting the precise nature of the cut and the slight smear of what appeared to be metal polish along its edges. Such marks suggested deliberate modification rather than accidental wear, though their purpose remained unclear. "The silver service requires similar examination," Inspector Slack continued, approaching the tea trolley with professional interest. "If electrical current was involved in Colonel Bryce's death, we must determine how it reached him during ordinary tea service." Mrs. Bryce watched these proceedings with apparent calm, though Miss Marple noted the careful way she positioned herself to observe every detail of the inspector's investigation. Her attention seemed particularly focused on his examination of the teapot and its associated accessories. Inspector Slack lifted each piece of the service with methodical precision, checking for any irregularities that might explain the mysterious electrical contact. The teapot, sugar bowl, and cream jug all appeared entirely normal, their silver surfaces showing only the expected patina of age and careful maintenance. It was while examining the individual teaspoons that Miss Marple made her next significant discovery. One spoon, slightly smaller than its companions, showed a curious discoloration at its tip, a tiny pitted area that appeared almost scorched, as though exposed to intense heat or electrical discharge. "Inspector," she ventured carefully, "might you examine this particular spoon? There appears to be some unusual marking on its surface." Inspector Slack accepted the indicated utensil with professional interest, holding it toward the window light for better examination. The discoloration was subtle, but unmistakable, a small area where the silver had been pitted and darkened in a pattern consistent with electrical arcing. "Curious indeed," he muttered, producing a magnifying glass for closer study. "This marking suggests contact with electrical current, though I cannot imagine how such a thing might occur during normal use. Mrs. Bryce approached to examine the spoon, her expression reflecting appropriate bewilderment at this unexpected discovery. How very strange. I cannot recall anything that might have caused such damage. Hilda is most careful with the silver service. Miss Marple continued her systematic examination of the tea service, while Inspector Slack documented his findings. The trolley itself deserved particular attention, she realized, given its central role in Tuesday's events and its proximity to various electrical fixtures. Lifting the white cloth that protected the trolley surface, Miss Marple discovered additional evidence that confirmed her growing suspicions. Beneath the fabric lay a short length of fine wire, its ends cleanly cut, and its surface bearing traces of the same metal polish that had marked the lamp cord. "Inspector, you might find this fragment of interest," she announced with careful neutrality, though her pulse quickened at the significance of this discovery. Inspector Slack examined the wire with growing attention, his professional experience recognizing the implications of its presence and condition. The clean cuts suggested deliberate preparation rather than accidental breakage, while the polished traces indicated attempts to conceal its true purpose. "This appears to be electrical wire," he observed grimly, "cut to specific length, and recently handled, judging by these marks. Its presence beneath the tea trolley cloth suggests involvement in some form of electrical modification." Mrs. Bryce's composure finally showed signs of strain as the evidence accumulated around her. The scorched teaspoon, the cut wire, and the various other anomalies were beginning to paint a picture that extended far beyond natural death during afternoon tea. "I cannot imagine how such items came to be associated with our tea service," she protested with diminishing conviction. "Perhaps some previous owner left these materials, or they became mixed with our possessions during one of our moves." Miss Marple noted the weakness of these explanations, particularly given the fresh condition of the wire and the recent nature of the teaspoon's damage. The evidence suggested careful preparation and deliberate concealment, rather than accidental accumulation of foreign objects. Inspector Slack's systematic examination revealed additional irregularities in the lamp's electrical connection. The plug showed signs of recent modification, with one pin slightly loose and traces of metallic filing around its base. Such alterations suggested tampering with safety features designed to prevent exactly the sort of electrical hazard that had apparently claimed Colonel Bryce's life. "Mrs. Bryce," Inspector Slack said with growing seriousness, "these discoveries require official investigation beyond my current authority. I must consult with superior officers about the implications of what we found." The widow's carefully maintained composure finally cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the strain she'd been concealing beneath her facade of shocked grief. The accumulating evidence was becoming impossible to explain through innocent coincidence or natural causes. Miss Marple observed these developments with the satisfaction of someone whose patient investigation was finally yielding definitive results. The technical evidence, combined with her previous observations about domestic arrangements and family motivations, was beginning to reveal the full scope of what had actually occurred in Briar Cottage's peaceful conservatory. The truth, she realized, would soon emerge through the methodical process of official investigation, though she suspected that Mrs. Bryce's carefully constructed deception would require considerable additional evidence before yielding to complete exposure. Chapter 9. The Lamp Cord with the Wrong Knot. The atmosphere at Briar Cottage had grown decidedly tense by the time Inspector Slack summoned additional assistance from the county constabulary. Miss Marple, whose presence had been requested by Mrs. Bryce for moral support, found herself in the unique position of observing both the official investigation and the subtle changes in the widow's demeanor as evidence continued to accumulate. Detective Sergeant Williams arrived from the county headquarters with the specialized knowledge that electrical crimes demanded. His methodical examination of the conservatory's wiring systems revealed complexities that had escaped Inspector Slack's initial assessment, though the local officer's thoroughness had provided an excellent foundation for more detailed analysis. The modifications to this lamp's electrical system are quite sophisticated, Sergeant Williams observed, tracing the path of the flex with professional interest. Someone with considerable technical knowledge has altered the standard wiring configuration. Miss Marple watched as the sergeant examined the lamp cord's routing beneath the tea trolley, his trained eye detecting irregularities that confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of Colonel Bryce's death. The placement of the flexible cable suggested careful planning rather than accidental arrangement. "Hilda," Miss Marple said gently to the maid who hovered anxiously nearby, "you mentioned that you typically secure appliance cords in a particular manner. Might you demonstrate your usual method?" Hilda approached the lamp with nervous deference, her work-worn hands moving automatically to arrange the excess cord and the tidy bow that characterized her housekeeping methods. "The quick, practical knot," she explained with quiet pride, "so nothing gets tangled or damaged during cleaning." Sergeant Williams compared Hilda's demonstration with the actual condition of the lamp cord, his expression growing increasingly grave as he noted the discrepancies. "This flex has been secured with a reef knot, tight, flat, and quite different from the bow you've just shown us." The distinction struck Miss Marple as potentially crucial evidence of tampering by someone other than the regular household staff. Hilda's habitual bow represented the automatic skill of long practice, while the reef knot suggested deliberate modification by someone with different training or intentions. "Mrs. Bryce?" Sergeant Williams inquired with professional courtesy. "Might you have adjusted this cord arrangement yourself at any recent time, Soreen?" Bryce's hesitation before answering revealed the strain of maintaining her careful composure under increasingly detailed scrutiny. "I may have tidied the area occasionally, though I'm not particularly skilled with such mechanical matters. Miss..." Marple noted this response with interest, recognizing in it the sort of careful ambiguity that characterized statements designed to avoid direct falsehood while concealing uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Bryce's claim of mechanical incompetence seemed inconsistent with the sophisticated electrical modifications that investigation was revealing. Sergeant Williams continued his systematic examination, his attention drawn to the area beneath the trolley where Miss Marple had discovered the fragment of cut wire. Further investigation revealed additional evidence that painted an increasingly clear picture of deliberate electrical tampering. "There are traces of metal polish on this flex," he announced, indicating minute smears along the cord's length. "Someone has cleaned this cable recently, which suggests awareness of its involvement in activities requiring concealment." The accumulating technical evidence was beginning to overwhelm Mrs. Bryce's carefully constructed explanations. Her composed facade showed increasing signs of strain, as each new discovery revealed the sophisticated nature of the electrical modifications that had transformed ordinary afternoon tea into a deadly trap. Inspector Slack, emboldened by the sergeant's findings, approached the investigation with renewed confidence. "Mrs. Bryce, these discoveries suggest that your husband's death resulted from deliberate electrical tampering rather than natural causes. The evidence indicates careful preparation and technical knowledge beyond casual household maintenance." Mrs. Bryce's response came with obvious effort, her voice carrying the careful control of someone fighting to maintain composure under extreme pressure. "I cannot explain these technical matters, Inspector. Arthur handled all such concerns during our marriage, and I've had little occasion to learn about electrical systems." Miss Marple found herself studying the widow's reactions with the intense attention she brought to particularly complex needlework patterns. Each response revealed additional layers of deception, carefully constructed to deflect suspicion, while avoiding statements that could be definitively proven false. Sergeant Williams completed his examination by documenting the precise configuration of wiring that had been concealed beneath the trolley's innocent appearance. His technical analysis revealed a level of sophistication that suggested considerable advanced planning and specialized knowledge. The modifications created a temporary electrical hazard that could be activated and deactivated at will, he explained to Inspector Slack with professional precision. The system was designed to appear entirely normal, except during the brief period when it posed mortal danger to anyone completing the electrical circuit. The explanation confirmed Miss Marple's growing understanding of the crime's true nature. Mrs. Bryce had created a murder weapon from ordinary household objects, using the victim's own habits and the familiar ritual of afternoon tea to ensure his destruction while maintaining the appearance of natural death. The reef not securing. This modified wiring is the final confirmation of deliberate preparation, Sergeant Williams continued. This type of knot requires specific knowledge and provides the security necessary for maintaining dangerous electrical connections under stress. Mrs. Bryce's composure finally began to crumble, as the technical evidence mounted beyond any possibility of innocent explanation. The sophisticated electrical trap, the careful timing, and the meticulous concealment all pointed toward premeditated murder executed with chilling precision. Mrs. Bryce, Inspector Slack said with the gravity that serious criminal charges demanded, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning regarding these discoveries. The evidence suggests that your husband's death resulted from deliberate criminal action rather than natural causes. Miss Marple observed the widow's final moments of freedom with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice would be served, yet the destruction of what had appeared a respectable household remained a tragedy that extended far beyond the immediate participants. As the official party prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected on the methodical nature of the crime they had uncovered. Mrs. Bryce had combined technical skill with intimate knowledge of her victim's habits to create what had nearly succeeded as the perfect domestic murder, defeated only by the accumulation of small inconsistencies that patient observation had finally revealed. Chapter 10: Evensong and the Widow's Lesson in Domestic Electricity. The soft chimes of evensong drifted across St. Mary Me as Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair in the vicarage sitting room, where the Reverend and Mrs. Clement had gathered a small group to hear her explanation of the tragic events at Briar Cottage. Lady Bantry occupied the settee with characteristic attention, while Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the window where the fading February light provided adequate illumination for his medical notes. The method, Miss Marple began, with the quiet precision that marked her approach to life's more perplexing mysteries, was both ingenious and appallingly simple. Mrs. Bryce transformed the silver teapot into a lethal weapon, using nothing more elaborate than a length of fine wire and her intimate knowledge of her husband's unvarying habits. She paused to adjust her knitting, though her attention remained focused on the explanation that would finally illuminate the domestic tragedy that had shocked their peaceful village. The teapot's hollow handle provided the perfect concealment for electrical modification. A thin wire, carefully soldered to the ferrule where it would remain invisible beneath the ornate silver work, ran beneath the quilted cozy and down through the trolley to connect with the lamp's electrical system. Lady Bantry leaned forward with sharp interest. But surely such a modification would be immediately apparent to anyone handling the service. Not if executed with sufficient skill, Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Bryce had spent considerable time learning the necessary techniques. The solder work was disguised through careful polishing, while the wire remained hidden beneath the tea cozy that she had scorched during her practice sessions with heated implements. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly as the technical aspects became clear. The electrical pathway would have made the entire teapot live with dangerous current. Anyone grasping the handle while simultaneously contacting an earth connection would complete a circuit across their body. Precisely, Doctor. And Mrs. Bryce ensured that such contact was inevitable through her careful domestic arrangements. The sugar bowl, positioned on the radiator, guaranteed that Colonel Bryce would rest his left hand on that grounded surface, while his right hand gripped the electrified teapot handle. Mrs. Clement shuddered delicately at the calculated nature of the crime. To use afternoon tea itself as a murder weapon seems particularly dreadful, a violation of domestic trust. Miss Marple continued her methodical explanation, her voice carrying the patient tone she employed when unraveling particularly complex knitting patterns. The penny inserted into the fuse box ensured that no safety device would interrupt the fatal current. A proper fuse would have prevented the electrical circuit from functioning, but the coin allowed unrestricted flow of dangerous voltage. The wet tiles completed the arrangement, Doctor added with professional understanding. Enhanced conductivity through the victim's leather-soled slippers, while Mrs. Bryce protected herself with rubber galoshes that provided effective insulation. Lady Bantry's practical mind engaged with the logistical complexities of the scheme. But how did she activate this electrical trap without endangering herself during preparation? The lamp's modified plug provided the control mechanism, Miss Marple explained. The earth pin had been loosened, and the live current diverted through her hidden wire connection. She could render the teapot safe or dangerous simply by plugging or unplugging the lamp, using the reef knot junction beneath the trolley cloth to maintain the necessary electrical connections. The assembled group absorbed these technical details with fascinated horror, recognizing in them the methodical planning that had transformed ordinary household objects into instruments of premeditated murder. The timing required extraordinary precision, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Bryce energized the system only moments before tea was served, ensuring that the felt coaster beneath the teapot retained the telltale heat ring that first aroused my suspicions. The warm base plug provided additional evidence of recent electrical activity. Reverend Clement spoke with the gravity that such revelations demanded. The motive, Miss Marple? What could drive someone to such elaborate deception? Financial desperation, disguised as domestic harmony, Miss Marple replied sadly. Colonel Bryce intended to alter his will in Martin's favor, reflecting his conviction that ladies should not manage monetary affairs. Mrs. Bryce faced the prospect of reduced circumstances that her pride could not accept. Lady Bantry nodded, with understanding born of long observation of village dynamics. Arthur's previous accident at the garden pump, was that also an attempt? I believe so, though less sophisticated in execution. When that failed to achieve the desired result, Mrs. Bryce developed the more elaborate electrical scheme that she felt certain would pass as natural cardiac failure. Dr. Haddock consulted his notes with professional interest. The burn mark on Colonel Bryce's palm, the electrical contact that triggered his heart failure, all consistent with current passing from the live teapot handle to the grounded radiator through his body. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the human elements of the tragedy. Why not Martin or Hilda as suspects? Martin possessed neither the technical knowledge nor the methodical temperament for such elaborate preparation. His debts were genuine, but his nature remained fundamentally honest. And Hilda? Mrs. Clement inquired gently. Dear Hilda would never have mopped the conservatory tiles to gleam just before entertaining guests. Such timing violated every principle of proper household management. Moreover, she never employed reef knots in her domestic work, preferring the quick bows that characterized her efficient methods. Most significantly, she genuinely loved Tibbs, who had been frightened by the electrical modifications to his favorite resting place. The room fell silent as the full scope of Mrs. Bryce's deception became apparent. The widow had exploited every aspect of domestic routine and family trust to create what had nearly succeeded as the perfect crime. Confronted with the accumulated evidence, Miss Marple concluded quietly, Mrs. Bryce finally acknowledged her actions with a simple statement: one must be practical. Inspector Slack arrested her with appropriate gravity. Lady Bantry shivered despite the sitting room's warmth. I shall never look at a tea service the same way, Jane. To think that such ordinary objects could conceal such deadly purpose. Miss Marple folded her knitting with the precise movements that concluded another successful investigation. It is not the tea itself that proves dangerous, dear Dolly, but the domestic arrangement surrounding it. Murder, like housekeeping, often depends upon which little wire one chooses to fasten and which one removes. As evening shadows gathered over St. Mary Me, the assembled group reflected on the sobering lesson that even the most peaceful village could harbor secrets dark enough to transform afternoon tea into an instrument of calculated murder, defeated only by the patient accumulation of small inconsistencies that revealed the truth beneath carefully constructed deception.